my God, whom I worship and adore, I bear witness unto thy unity and thy oneness, and acknowledge thy gifts, both in the past and in the present. Thou art the all-bountiful, the overflowing showers of whose mercy have rained down upon high and low alike, and the splendors of whose grace have been shed over both the obedient and the rebellious. O God of mercy, before whose door the quintessence of mercy hath bowed down, and round the sanctuary of whose cause loving kindness in its inmost spirit hath circled, we beseech thee, entreating thine ancient grace and seeking thy present favor, that thou mayest have mercy upon all who are the manifestations of the world of being, and deny them not the outpourings of thy grace in thy days. All are but poor and needy, and thou verily art the all-possessing, the all-subduing, the all-powerful. Baha'u'llah.
Oh, thank you, Kylie. Tim, are you ready?
Yes, I am. The door of the knowledge of the ancient days being thus closed in the face of all beings, the source of infinite grace, according to his saying, his grace hath transcended all things. My grace hath encompassed them all, hath caused those luminous gems of holiness to appear out of the realm of the spirit in the noble form of the human temple, and be made manifest unto all men, that they may impart unto the world the mysteries of the unchangeable being, and tell of the subtleties of his imperishable essence. These sanctified mirrors, these day springs of ancient glory, are, one and all, the exponents on earth of him who is the central orb of the universe, its essence and ultimate purpose. From him proceed their knowledge and power. From him is their derived sovereignty. The beauty of their countenance is but a reflection of his image, and their revelation a sign of his deathless glory. They are the treasures of divine knowledge and the repositories of celestial wisdom. Through them is transmitted a grace that is infinite, and by them is revealed the light that can never fade. These tabernacles of holiness, 48 these primal mirrors which reflect the light of unfading glory, are but expressions of him who is the invisible of the invisibles. By the revelation of these gems of divine virtue, all the names and attributes of God, such as knowledge and power, sovereignty and dominion, mercy and wisdom, glory, bounty, and grace, are made manifest. These attributes of God are not, and have never been, vouchsafed especially unto certain prophets and withheld from others. Nay, all the prophets of God, his well-favored, his holy and chosen messengers, are, without exception, the bearers of his names and the embodiments of his attributes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tim. Albert, are you ready?
Yes, I am. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. I'd like to begin by giving a brief introduction of somebody who is not our speaker tonight, but one of the first leaders of the Baha'i faith, a man by the name of Abdul Baha. And, it was at the turn of the 20th century that he came to this country, and he preached in various capacities in various cities and in various forums. And he had one quote that I want to read. It's very brief. And he said, we need to attach great importance to the indigenous population of America. For these souls may be likened unto the ancient inhabitants of the Arabian Peninsula, who, prior to the mission of Muhammad, were likened unto savages. When the light of Muhammad shone forth in their midst, however, they became so radiant as to illumine the whole world. Likewise, these Indians, once they become educated and guided, there can be no doubt that they will become so illumined as to enlighten the whole world. This topic, this fascinating topic, is being talked to us and explained to us by a member of the legendary Bathke family. John, who we've had the honor of hearing from both of his parents recently, is a member of the Navajo Nation, He's currently living in Eastern San Diego County. He is a core faculty member of the Master of Organizational Management program within the Forbes School of Business and Technology at the University of Arizona Global Campus. John is an educator, and some of the other institutions that he's taught for include the University of San Diego State University, California State University at San Bernardino, UCLA Extension, Alliant International University, and Cumier Community College. What makes John so special is his involvement with diversity, equity, and inclusion, a topic that all Baha'is strive to embody, but John has made a career out of embodying. He's involved with DEI efforts within his university, and he's previously worked with a couple of tribal governments in Southern California and Arizona, focusing on issues of cultural preservation, indigenous education, and tribal sovereignty. Now, this man is an attorney, teaching business, coming from a Native American background, working to preserve not only the history of his people, but the peoples of many different tribes within this region. And so he is uniquely capable of teaching us exactly what is going to be happening tonight, the parallel views of indigenous spirituality and the Baha'i faith. John, we're honored to have you. The floor is yours.
Thank you for the wonderful introduction. Appreciate that. So before I begin, let me introduce myself traditionally. John Bathke Yinishe, Sinjikini Nishli, Bilagana Dasha Bashashin, Todachini Dasha Che, Bilagana Dasha Nelly. So as it was shared in my introduction, I'm originally from the Navajo Nation in Arizona, but I've lived many places. And actually, I think this fireside is hosted out of Bethesda, Maryland. And our family, well, I grew up in Maryland as a child. So I have many, many fond memories of Maryland. We lived in Silver Spring, but we did a lot with the Bahai communities of Maryland, DC, and Virginia. And so it just was a great place to grow up as a young Baha'i kid. So anyway, I always have a soft to bridge the community, to be back, as it were. So tonight, you know, I know you shared my introduction, my background, but I'm just, you know, one individual indigenous who's just sharing his views on the parallels between the Baha'i community and the Baha'i faith and indigenous spirituality. And so, you know, I've had a lot of chance to think about this, but anyway, I'm just kind of, you know, offering my individual views. There's certainly a lot of other Native Baha'i enlightened on the subject, such as my mom. But I'm just going to share, you know, what I've kind of learned over the years. And so before I go on, I just kind of want to first talk about spirituality. Why I use that term. Actually, before that, I kind of want to define indigenous, and I like to use that term indigenous. And when I've taught classes, I tell my students that indigenous really is comprised of what I call the Holy Trinity, the three components, and that is these people that have land, language, and their nation, their people. And all that together they see as one, that one can't exist without the other. And so, you know, all indigenous nations feel that they were placed here by the Creator. And so that is, you know, more than, I guess, how other people view their, for lack of a better term, their nationality. Their identity is spiritually based, comes from the Creator, and was placed on their traditional lands, and they were given a specific language, and they are a specific people, and they're there for a spiritual purpose. And so that more or less is how I kind of share with others my notion of what indigenous is. And of course, a lot of this is based on oral tradition, which is very different than Western tradition, which is based on the written word. But that's kind of a background of when I use the term indigenous, and why I use the term indigenous. So before going on, I like to use the term spirituality when in reference to Indian nations, because a lot of traditional beliefs kind of fall along those lines, in the sense that a lot of times when we use the term religion, it tends to be very, especially from a Western context, very dogmatic, very rigid, and in many ways authoritarian. Many have clergy that kind of dictate how a religion is taught and spread and defined. Whereas with Native spirituality is not so confining, tends to be more individually driven. You have spiritual leaders, and for Navajo, we call them chanters, or otherwise known as medicine men. But a lot of the spiritual endeavors are individually driven or family driven, and so there isn't a strong defined hierarchy, and it tends to be more flexible. But still, strong beliefs are maintained, just as in what we call religion. But that's kind of backdrop of why I used spirituality. And if you excuse me, I'm referring to some notes. If I look down, it's just I'm referring to some notes that I've taken. So, having said that, though, as I go on, I'll tend to use the term nations rather than tribes, only because I think politically and culturally that's more appropriate. Although you will hear other indigenous people refer to their tribe and what have you. A lot of, like, for example, archaeology has, as a discipline, gone away from using the term tribe and using the term nation, only because it's more politically accurate in its description. But having said that, there's over 500 different Indian communities within America. More than 500, and so that tends, obviously, will reflect a lot of diversity. There's a lot of diversity within indigenous spirituality, and especially one big difference is the lower 48 as compared to, like, Alaska Natives. Their spirituality has a little different focus, many different themes, but having said that, especially in the lower 48, there is a lot of many similarities. We tend to recognize the four directions. The four directions played a very important role. Certain animals play important central figures within a lot of spirituality, such as the eagle and the bear. And those are kind of recognizable across many Indian nations. But when you get down to many specifics, there'll be a lot of differences, as you can appreciate. For example, Navajo and Hopi, many Indian nations will do a lot of ceremonies and orient themselves in a clockwise manner. So like for Navajo, when you go into a home, you walk in and you go in clockwise. Whereas Hopi, they actually go counterclockwise. So it's a little different. And, when you get down to it, there's a lot of, there will be a lot of specific differences. But having said that, I think it's important to note that since the early to mid 1800s, there has been developing a lot of what I call a pan-Indian unity. And it's very interesting because this happened basically around the development of, Declaration of the Bab and the Bahai faith. So as you know, in the mid 1800s, quote unquote, the Indian wars were going on. Indians were being killed, forced onto reservations. And a lot of their traditional life was being destroyed. A lot of their traditional lands were being taken away from them. And there were, many of them were forced to migrate and to different places. And many of them were sort of imprisoned as it were. But at the same time, historically, where a lot of Indian nations from a very ancient time would see themselves as enemies. During this time, they developed a sense of unity. And I'll use one example, although it's not necessarily spiritually oriented, but so what is known as the Battle of Little Bighorn, where Custer was defeated, was actually a multi-Indian endeavor. So it wasn't just Lakota that were there. There were Crow involved and other Plains Indians, and they came together in spite of their historical differences and unified in this battle. But there were other examples. One spiritual example is what many people now know as the ghost dance. And so the ghost dance, where its history or its belief was that if the practitioners did this dance and the prayers associated with it, then the spirits of their ancestors would come alive and would help them in their time of need. And this is during the time when, as I mentioned, there was a lot of strife and turmoil, death and destruction, a lot of military campaigns or what have you. And so a lot of Indian people, communities turned to this dance. But it's really interesting because the dance itself, although it became very popular with the Lakota in the plains, it originated from a Paiute medicine person. His name was Wovoka. And he's the one that brought forth the ghost dance. And so it actually was, at that time, spread like wildfire and was adopted by many different Indian nations. And in that way brought a sense of unity to many of these Indian nations. And so, from that, and again, it's very interesting that all this happened during the time when the Bob declared his mission, and then later Baha'u'llah, but then also when the Holy Family, Baha'u'llah and his family, were exiled from Iran to Iraq, to then Turkey, and then to the Holy Land. Likewise, the Navajo, as well as we famously know of the Cherokee and the other 5 civilized tribes, they went on the Trail of Tears, and they were exiled from their home. The Navajos likewise had a what they call the Long Walk, where they were rounded up and forced to go away from their traditional lands to Bosque Redondo, Fort Sumner in New Mexico. And so they were in exile, basically, at the same time that the Holy Family was being exiled from city to city. So, but I use that example for many different reasons, but to kind of share the notion that since that time, which coincides with the birth and development of faith, a lot of Indian nations have, been more unified, that there has developed this pan-Indian unity, and it's been growing stronger ever since. So, as I said, in very ancient times, a lot of Indian nations would see themselves as strict enemies. During this time, they developed a love and appreciation of their, of each other and and recognized the similarities and unity they had with each other, rather than, focusing on the differences. And so I just kind of want to want to share that as a backdrop, and it kind of relates to the quote that was shared before, and to a certain extent, I kind of didn't want to share that quote, even though it has a lot of his import to it. But I think there's a lot that needs to be parsed in that quote. But having said that, you know, I think along the lines of what I just shared, and we'll kind of get to that, is, you know, where the future role that Indigenous can play and how it's similar to the Arab nations and what happened under Muhammad. So, but we'll, as we kind of wind down, we can get more into that. And so anyway, that's kind of a bit of a backdrop, but that's kind of how you know, I approach this subject. And so, what are, you know, getting specifically to the subject? You know, I don't know what some of the friends, Bahai or not, you know, some of the concepts they have about Indigenous spirituality. But one of the main similarities, and there are many, is that Indigenous as well as Baha'is believe in a higher being. You know, of course, Baha'is, you know, believe in God, that God created us. But this is similarly true with all Indigenous beliefs. All Indigenous spirituality believes that there was a creator, that there was a highest spiritual entity that created the land, that created us, created all the animals and plants and everything that we enjoy. But you know, also, and likewise, created the specific languages that each Indigenous language speaks, and gave that, you know, in a way to each Indian nation. So, you know, each Indian nation was kind of, in a way, bequeathed their traditional lands, and they were bequeathed their own Indigenous language that they're used really to promote spirituality. That a lot of that is the, you know, the main goal, and we'll talk a little bit about that. That, you know, languages to use to promote the spiritual purpose of each people, and as well as you know, they were given each other as a nation. But it's very interesting because I think likewise, you know, Baha'i faith has you know, very similar views that in a way that this creation was given to man, but we're here to use it for spiritual purposes. But it was given to us by the Creator. And so that's kind of, you know, one of the main similarities that I think that you know, the Baha'i faith and traditional Indigenous spirituality has, is that there is a Creator, but the Creator you know, created everything, but shared that with man, ultimately to use for spiritual purposes. One of the other main similarities between the Baha'i faith and Indigenous spirituality is the essential and necessary use of prayer. So in Indigenous culture, prayer is essential for Native spirituality. A lot of you know, most ceremonies revolve around prayers, and a lot of ceremonies involve the use of many different prayers. You know, many Navajo ceremonies, for example, and I'll use the example of Navajo just because that's my background. And before going on, I'll just share that you know, I was raised I'm Bahai and Navajo, so, you know, I identify as both. I'm not as traditional as my mom per se, and I'm still learning. I'm relearning my indigenous language, but this is I recognize as part of my identity, and it's been learning as part of my spiritual journey. But having said that, a lot of like specifically Navajo ceremonies will go several days long. One ceremony goes nine days or 9 nights to be more specific, and each night many different prayers, and actually it's essentially chanting. A lot of indigenous prayers are sung, whether just by themselves, and many, as many have seen, are sung with a drum. Some are sung with a board rattle. So there are many different ways in which indigenous people pray. So a lot of the songs that you hear from indigenous, a lot of them are prayers, as a matter of fact. And so, but for the Baha'is, prayer is essential. In tono, my servant is one phrase that we learn, specifically in Ruhi Book 1. But we're asked as Baha'is to pray every day. We have obligatory prayer that we say, and that for special reasons and events and for other purposes, that we're asked to say prayers. So, prayer is very essential for indigenous spirituality and for Baha'i, Baha'i belief, that it is, essentially mandatory for both sets of spiritualities. And having said that, related to that is meditation is a very important part of, or can be, for Native spirituality. Lakota are very famous for their vision quest, and I'm not an expert on Lakota culture, but the best I understand it, and someone could correct me if I'm wrong, but this is just my own understanding, is a vision quest can last up to 4 days, where an individual goes out by themselves in the wilderness and essentially just meditates and fasts at the same time. But in this regard, I'm focusing on the meditation. That meditation is a very important practice that a lot of indigenous use, to gain spiritual insight, to draw closer guidance from the Creator, and so it's very important. And likewise with the Baha'i faith, we are asked to meditate daily, but especially on a lot of important issues, especially spiritual issues, we're asked to meditate. And so it is a practice that is used in both cultures. I also just alluded to that, but fasting as a practice is important to both cultures. For a lot of indigenous cultures, fasting is an essential part to gain better spiritual knowledge and a way to cleanse oneself, to clean the ego, and to have more correct understanding of what the Creator wants us to do. Some communities are use that practice a lot. I've kind of mentioned the Lakota. They do that in their vision quest, but they also do that with their sun dance, which happens in the summer, and practitioners will fast, I think also for 4 days. But that is also part of the spiritual practice, where they form a self-sacrifice, to gain spiritual insight. And likewise, the Baha'i faith it has an annual fast, where for 19 days between sunrise and sunset, those that are physically able to are asked to abstain from food and drink and to reflect on spiritual issues. And it's also used as a way of cleansing our, for lack of a better term, our soul, cleansing our spirituality so that, we can, have stronger understanding also in the same way of what the Creator wants us to do. But basically for the same reasons that we're both asked for a time to self-sacrifice that can help with the spiritual cleansing in a way to improve our spiritual insight and spiritual understanding and spiritual vision. So it's both are very identical in that regard. It's a practice that is appreciated by many indigenous cultures. Another thing that another aspect of similarity between the indigenous culture and Baha'i culture is that for indigenous understand and view, and I'm generalizing, but I think I'll just, this is kind of fair to say, that there is a unity in all of creation, that not only is mankind one, or we all are related, but even further to that than that we're all related to this cosmos, to this world, so that we have a relationship with the earth, we have a relationship with the animals, we have a relationship with the cosmos, with the stars, and everything that is around us. And likewise, with the Baha'i faith, there's one of the central principles is the oneness of mankind. And actually, going back to indigenous, there's many different ways in which indigenous people conceptualize themselves. But it's not uncommon, though, for many indigenous to explain and differentiate themselves as being the five-fingered ones. That we are an entity we're different because we have five fingers. So we're different than, animals that have claws, birds that have wings, or, other insects or other animals that, will have different characteristics. But an extension of that is that basically, as I understand it, is that all those that have five fingers, in essence, are part of the same family. So in other words, all humans are part of the same family. We have our own spiritual identity, but in same ways, we have a spiritual unity. So that as long as you are a five-fingered one, then we have a relationship. So regardless of someone being, a different race, different nationality, maybe even, also different gender, what have you, if we are five-fingered ones, we all are one and a part of the same reality. And so, it's a, in a way, it's a spiritual conceptualization and spiritual distinction, but at the same time, brings kind of also acknowledges the oneness of all of us. But also, as I mentioned, more than beings, that we're related to this world, that we're not separate from the reality around us, that we're not separate from the earth, we're not separate from the animals that we call brothers and sisters, and all the other elements, the sun and the moon and the wind, they're all part of our collective unity and collective reality. And in the Baha'i faith also, believes that we're all a part of one reality that we share together. Um, so, but kind of expanding on that a little, one important aspect, and I've kind of alluded to it before, is that for a lot of indigenous people, very central, and I've kind of made reference to one of the definitions of indigenous is the land, but that we all, as indigenous, we belong to the Mother Earth, that the earth is our mother, and that it's a important spiritual understanding of the land, and that we all come from it, and we all are, everything comes from the land, comes from Mother Earth. But then likewise, we all return to it. That when our cycle is done, and we've finished our tasks on this mortal life, that we return to Mother Earth and join her. But the importance of that is very strong within indigenous cultures. And one example that I share is you can see that was the rise of the water protectors out of Standing Rock a few years ago, that they arose, to make although many people focus on the political statement, it really was a spiritual statement that they were making, and that they were saying that the earth, but then also specifically the water, were spiritual beings, spiritual entities, part of Mother Earth that we need to protect and we need to safeguard. And that was, I think a very strong but common belief that all indigenous have, is that we come from Mother Earth, that we are bound to Mother Earth, but we also need to protect Mother Earth. And that is, one of our spiritual charges, is that we have to live in harmony with the land, but we also are charged with protecting it. And that's why you saw that strong, response from the water protectors of Standing Rock. But it also, I think, the Baha'i faith also recognizes the importance of the land, and that we need to protect it. For lack of a better term, a lot of people, non-Indians, we use the term environmentalism, but as Baha'is, we are asked to live sustainable lives, to be respectful of the land, and to to protect nature as much as possible. So, but there's also a quote that from the Baha'i writings that makes me kind of think about this similarity. And it's from the tablet of visitation for the shrine of Abdul Baha. And it says, "Grant that I may offer up my soul for the earth ennobled by the footsteps of thy chosen ones, O Lord of glory in the highest." But kind of recognizing, acknowledging, when I hear that, I think of Mother Earth and our connection to Mother Earth, and that we also are asked to be as humble as as Mother Earth is, and likewise, that's what Abdul Baha is supplicating, that we can be as humble but as great as what Mother Earth is, and all that Mother Earth stands for. So when I hear that prayer, that tablet visitation, which I know my mom very, very much cherishes, that's what I think about. But one thing that's very interesting is kind of a very peculiar with many Indian nations, not all Indian nations, but I'll share this because it pertains from a Navajo perspective, is that there is a similarity specifically in the twin manifestations. So in the Baha'i faith, we believe in the twin manifestations, that the Bab came, declared his mission, but paved the way for him whom God shall make manifest, which was Baha'u'llah, and basically prepared the world for the coming of Baha'u'llah. And but their messages, although separate, existed for the same purpose, and that was to pave the way for the message of Baha'u'llah. And so they are referred to as the twin manifestations, and you really can't separate the two in that regard, in terms of the beginning of this Baha'i dispensation, that they basically were one, although they were separate. But again, they're called the twin manifestations. And so a lot of Indian cultures actually have twin manifestations as the root of their spiritual beliefs. So for Navajo, it was the holy twins that came and brought spirituality to the Navajo people. They were the ones that brought the message from the Creator and shared it with the Navajo people. And so that, and they're referred to as the holy twins. And they're, in that regard, the primal teachers of Navajo spirituality, the primal messengers, but again referred to as the twins. Now, I live in San Diego. I've worked with the Kumeyaay Nation for about 9 years, and their creation story and their indigenous belief also has twins as the center of their spirituality. That it was twin brothers that came and taught the Kumeyaay their spiritual life and tools and their spiritual destiny and purpose. But they also have a set of twins that was centered to their spiritual belief. And so, from that perspective, it's peculiar and particular and very specific, but it's not foreign to think of the concept of twin manifestations, having shared a message from the Creator, from God, to the people of this earth. In that regard, the Baha'i faith, although it obviously it acknowledges all the major manifestations of the past, beginning from Abraham, onto Zoroaster, the Eastern religions, Krishna and Buddha, but now acknowledges the Judeo-Christians, Moses, Muhammad, Christ, and all the major manifestations. But in the writings, it specifically says that there were minor manifestations that came and shared, a message from God to a given people. And, in my own understanding, that is the Navajo twins, for example, that they were the minor manifestations that shared the Creator's message, God's message, with the Navajo people, at that time. So that's a kind of very, specific thing. But going back to, to the land, that, although that is an important belief in the Baha'i faith, that may be like a specific area where actually the Baha'i friends can learn from the indigenous friends, the importance of the land and the spiritual relationship that we all have with the land, and this and all the things that are part of Mother Earth. I tell my daughter, going back to the water protectors, and they were there in large part to protect the water for threat of pollution, from an oil pipeline. But indigenous view everything, but specifically we look at water, from a spiritual perspective, that it has spiritual importance and is not to be used, wastefully. It's not to be used in a bad way, and that we are to revere it, and that it has a spiritual purpose. Because and I was telling my daughter that you think about it, specifically water, everything you see around you is affected or produced or touched by water. Everything around us, and obviously including us, was by necessity includes the use of water. And what other spiritually important purpose can an element have than basically shaping our reality? In every aspect of our reality, water plays a role. And that's one of the reasons why, water is a spiritually important element for a lot of Indigenous people. And Indigenous, have that understanding and that appreciation. And, that was one of the main impetuses for, the water protectors. But to go on to another subject, one of the other similarities that Indigenous cultures have with the Baha'i faith is a belief in the next world. So, in English, a lot of Indigenous communities will use that term, the next world. That our soul as Indigenous people, although the mortal body will pass away, the soul will go on to its journey into the next world, and likewise with the Baha'i faith, it is on a journey, and in the same way as the Baha'i faith, though, that this mortal material world that we're all living in, although important and has a certain function, is really just an illusion, that reality, true reality, exists in the next world. And that's really, the same in terms of, what Baha'i belief. And, the Baha'i friends use the term the Abha kingdom. And that is where our souls go after the mortal body has passed. It goes on to the Abha kingdom, and basically on to its spiritual journey to get closer to the Creator. But likewise, that this physical reality is not the true reality. That our true reality is the spiritual one in the spiritual worlds, where our soul, exists. And so, those beliefs are very, very identical. That our soul will doesn't die at the physical death of our body, that it's liberated and it continues on its spiritual journey, getting closer to the Creator. And so, very similar. But and kind of related to that, I was going to mention before, is that to a certain extent, Baha'is believe in what Indigenous believe in what Baha'is refer to as the concourse on high. So in Baha'i belief, my understanding, concourse on high is basically the spirits of all the departed friends that go on to the next world, but are there, as a collective cadre of souls, a collective unity of souls that are there to, assist us in our daily endeavors or specific endeavors, and our collective endeavors in the faith, and that we're asked to ask for assistance for the concourse on high, that they are there as spiritual beings, as a collective spiritual entity. They're willing and waiting to help us at all times, so that we are to pray for them and to ask for their assistance. But a lot of Indigenous spiritual beliefs also have a very strong connection with their departed ancestors, that we pray to our departed ancestors to ask them for assistance and to come and to give us guidance and to give us assistance, both in our daily endeavors, but as well as our collective endeavors and everything that we're doing to in our spiritual life and to help as well as the material. But essentially the same thing, that when we invoke as Indigenous our spiritual deceased ancestors, that likewise Baha'is are reaching out to the concourse on high and asking for assistance. So very similar spiritual conceptualization there that relates to prayer as well. But I think one of the most fundamental views that really show a parallel between the two cultures is that we're here for we're all here for a spiritual purpose. So in Navajo, my own understanding is that the main central belief within Navajo culture is something that's called Holjo, which translated into English is loosely translated as beauty. And so a lot of things will revolve around this concept of Holjo. And there are a lot of ceremonies are centered around that. But as individual and families and as a nation, spiritually, we are charged with spreading Holjo. We're specifically charged to spread beauty. And that can take many forms and many different shapes and many different purposes. But we're here to make this world a better spiritual and material place. And that if we do that, by doing that, we could spread Holjo. But it's very central to the charge of Navajo. But a lot of other Indigenous cultures, have that spiritual charge as well, to spread harmony, to spread love. And so that there's a spiritual purpose to our lives that is very central to Indigenous identity and spirituality. And that's, basically the purpose of each Indigenous is that, as I mentioned before, the Creator gave us this reality and this land, but we are to use it in a spiritual way to make things better for ourselves, for our families, but for others. And there are many different applications of that. But we're given a spiritual charge as Indigenous. But likewise, with Baha'is, one of there's kind of two ways to look at it. But central to Baha'i faith is unity. That we are to promote unity wherever we go, and that unity will take many different shapes and many different forms. And this actually in a way kind of relates back to it makes me think back, because we look at the Baha'i faith, and if you look at everything beginning in the Baha'i faith, beginning with Baha'u'llah, of course, break it down in Arabic, Baha means glory, Allah of God. Baha'u'llah means the glory of God. And we look at Bahai. Bahai is basically a believer in glory, a spreader of glory, of this glory that was shared in the Baha'i faith by Baha'u'llah. And then I made a reference to Abha. Abha has the same root as glory. And so everything, relates back to that glory and the glory of God. And so for me, it's very easy to see the similarity between something like Baha and glory, and the glory that we're supposed to share from God, as Hojon, and how they're very similar. That Baha'is, we believe in the glory of God, and we're there to share that spiritual message and to help others. But likewise, for Indigenous, or I use the Navajo example, we're there to spread Hojon, we're there to spread beauty amongst ourselves and everyone we come into contact with. And so there's, that fundamental spiritual purpose that I think is similar between the two cultures and the two spiritualities. So having said that, one of the conclusions are, I guess, I don't know, for lack of a better term, conclusion that I like to share though, is that as a Indigenous in the Baha'i faith, there's nothing that Indigenous needs to give up to also to be Baha'i. That you can be Baha'i and Indigenous at the same time. That they really are in unity, that there really is no difference between those spiritual beliefs. And that, in fact, in the Baha'i faith, we're encouraged to, maintain our culture and our languages and to, promote cultural education in that regard. And so actually as Baha'is, we're charged in this regard with preserving native culture, promoting use of Indigenous language and Indigenous spirituality. But as an Indigenous, as in my case, there's nothing in the Baha'i faith that prohibits me from, doing Navajo ceremonies, as well as Baha'i, being a Baha'i and practicing as any other. And so, as an Indigenous, there's nothing that I have to give up in order to embrace the Baha'i faith and share the Baha'i faith. Kind of going back to that quote, again, I try not to share that quote because, well, for one, it kind of uses dated language, and we have to be careful about how that is used. But I think it's very important because, there were a lot of similarities between in this case, I'll use the term tribes of Arabia and the Indian nations of America. And that, before, as I was saying, from a very ancient time, there was a lot of disunity. There was a lot of, I don't even want to say dissension, because it's not like they agreed on things per se, that there was, very clear identity, we're of this nation, they're of that nation, and what have you. But, we look at the example of Muhammad and what he did with the people of Arabia, and that he united them. And by doing so, made them not only stronger, but spiritually stronger. And they were then, able to spiritually enlighten the world. And of course, as we all know, they were the foundation of the Renaissance. They were the foundation. They're essentially the foundation of Western knowledge as we know it. They learned, the Europeans learned from the Arabic people. And so I think there's more to learn from that quote. I'm still kind of trying to understand, develop a better understanding for that quote. But I think that, as I kind of alluded to before, I think that unity amongst a lot of the Indian nations has, been developing, is developing. And I think that, and again, a good example of how that can be positively manifested is with the water protectors at Standing Rock, and how hundreds of Indian nations and several non-Indigenous groups came together and were united for spiritual purpose. If we as Indigenous people can, build and expand and rely upon that unity, I think then we can, be more spiritually effective, and like specifically sharing the message about Mother Earth and sharing how important Mother Earth is to all of us. Kind of like the issue, for the American Baha'is, the issue of racism, how we're supposed to not look at it purely from like a societal perspective or material perspective, but we're supposed to examine it from a spiritual and moral perspective. And likewise, there are a lot of issues that I think that the Indigenous friends can share with the Baha'is in the world, like specifically about Mother Earth and its our spiritual and moral imperative to protect Mother Earth and preserve Mother Earth. And there are other examples that that can be shared and discussed. But these are very strong beliefs within a lot of Indigenous cultures, and so. But these are just kind of the tip of the iceberg. There are a lot of other, if we get more into it, a lot of very specific issues. But you can see, kind of in broad strokes, how Indigenous spirituality is very parallel and similar with Baha'i spirituality, and that they both serve a same function and have a same goal, and that not only can Indigenous learn and help the Baha'is, but then likewise Baha'is can learn and help Indigenous. And so that's in essence what I wanted to share. And so I can open it up for any questions or comments at this time. There was something else I was going to share, but it takes a little time, so I'll save that for another time.
Wow. Thank you so much, John. I can't thank you enough, really, for educating us really about Indian nation and brothers and sisters of Indigenous people, really. And I can see as a father, your mom and dad are sitting there and thanking God for you were given John Bathke, really, because I know you as a young man that you were when you were in Maryland, and we were very close. And Bathke family, like I remember. This is amazing, and see you now, and these gems of virtues coming out of your mouth and really helping us to understand. It makes me so happy, and share that joy with Alice and Jerry. Really, that wonderful. And this water that you said, it is so important in Islam. There is a passage that he said, everything gets its life from water. وَمِنَ الْمَاءِ كُلُّ شَيْءٍ حَيٍّ. He said, this is so important in that things. And you're so right. This is spirituality, really the core, and that's wonderful. And I'm going to call you back because there are so much more in this. and the way that you share with me makes us so, happy to learn, really. This is wonderful. As an educator, I can really appreciate that very much. Alex, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you, John, for an excellent presentation this evening, and for introducing to us a lot of the similarities that the two cultures have in terms of prayer and approach to the afterlife, and the approach to meditation, and the approach to our relationship with the earth on which we all reside. And so with the spiritual and cultural similarities that you outlined between these two cultures and these two ways of life, have you found the connection between the two communities to be particularly strong? And are there examples that you can share that highlight moments of unity between the indigenous communities and the indigenous nations and the Baha'i faith?
Well, to be honest, my first reaction is I actually want to defer to my parents. My parents would be much more better able to answer that, because they were the co-administrators of NABI, which is the Native American Baha'i Institute, and that was for about 15 years. Their charge was to interface the Baha'is with the indigenous. So they probably have more relevant and salient examples than myself. But I don't know if you, Mom and Dad, if you guys want to share.
Alex, could you unmute? Yeah, that's it. Alice and Jerry.
There you go.
Well, thank you. I'll offer a few examples. At the urging of our national and international institutions, there have in the last 50 years been many indigenous travelers who have carried their culture to the far corners of the world at the urging of the World Center and the NSA, and they've been organized with the help of the Continental Counselors resident in those distant lands. One example would be about 20 years ago, a small team, including Kevin Locke, a previous speaker, and his mother, as well as Linda Wilson and a Hopi elder and a young man from Southern Arizona at the time, were sent at the request of the World Center to Mongolia, because they thought there would be enough somewhat likeness, if you will, in many ways that they could have a lot of accomplishment. And they did. They were there the whole summer, and they even signed a document said that families knew they might never come back, that something might happen along the way, they might get sick or something. But they traveled throughout Mongolia. And what happened within a few years, when the Institute process was introduced after their coming to Mongolia, Mongolia was one of the parts of the world that took off like a rocket in the teaching, and pioneers went there and other travel teachers. I say that because that spiritual light was carried to that region by a team of indigenous people who gave their all, night and day, for a whole summer, and then they traveled through that part of Russia as well. So that's just one example, and there's been many, many other examples of a trail of light coming up through the Americas, from the tip of South America and from the Central America and the islands near Panama. And this was all went the way to the far north corner of Alaska and ended up at Nia Bay in Washington, uniting people, uniting tribes. Maybe I've said enough, I don't know. Mom wanted to give another kind of example, but there's so many kinds of examples. And in that, NABI has trained people and sent them out to different tribes and to different communities where people need to learn what John has just shared with us.
Well, one of the things is, as you know, so many things have happened to Indian people, our ancestors, and you know the Buddhist schools and all the things that have happened to a lot of the Indian children. And it was no different with my family. And one of the things that I've concluded about my mom and dad is they really were able to talk to us about cultural things, because they went to boarding school from grade 1 through 12. And it was, at that time, all that information about our language and every culture was being drained out of them. And so today, a lot of people have real resistance to religion, and it's only when you bring these similarities that people feel comfortable about the Baha'i faith. And there are so many of the friends who love the faith, but they're cautious about it. And until you live the life, then they understand. And when we were in San Diego at one time, Amy had to go to a reunion of University of Chicago students. And these were young adults, or some adults. Anyway, the spouse of one of them was said he was writing his PhD, and he wanted to write a book. And then I was sitting there next to him, and we were talking about the subject of religion came up, and he said he was making inaccurate conclusions about a lot of things. But when I told him I was a Baha'i, he almost jumped out of air. He said, "No Indian should belong to any religion because of what religion has done to your people." And I said, of all the religions that that has restored our pride, our culture, our language, and everything about being true to ourselves is the Baha'i faith. And he said, "Oh, I cannot believe it. I cannot believe it. No religion has ever done that to the Indian people." But so it was, it's hard to convince people that, religion is something to be careful about in the Indian nations. But there's a lot of trust. People trust the Baha'is more than any other group, because they will quickly come to the conclusion that in Christianity, of which there's a lot of Christians on reservations, is they just say, I don't know which church they have over there. Oh, a whole bunch of different churches that they go to.
Dr. Banik, do you have any comments? Good to see you. I knew this topic will interest you very much. Very good.
Interestingly enough, my move from New York to North Carolina was kicked off because my wife chose for us to honeymoon in the mountains, the Smoky Mountains of North Carolina, where the Cherokee Nation still holds their own land, and they control a lot of the things there. And as an island person from the island of Jamaica, we have indigenous people we were told that disappeared until we're starting to find in our genes. And there are a lot of us who have been mixed in with those indigenous people. And in a sense, our roots are actually deeply rooted in the indigenous people as they traveled all along the area that he talked about, the tip of South America, all the way up to the Bering Strait. In fact, at one point I had somebody, we were discussing how the worldview is different when you're from a different place. we learned that Russia is a part of the Asian continent, but when you come to America, you have to put things in black and white. And so nobody considered that Russia and China borders on the east, and then Mongolia. They don't understand that there's a whole connection there between people. And if we start looking at people as enemies, because we think that they're so different from us, it's actually a part of those people are a part of us. Interestingly enough, the women in the Cherokee culture chose the war chief and the peace chief. The war chief wore red and the peace chief wore white. And the women were able to tell the personality of the boys since they were growing up, which ones would be more inclined to be the warriors and which one would be more of diplomats. And for them to be so decisive in terms of who would rule over their people at a certain time is a lesson to us about the equality of men and women. I see the connection right away between the indigenous people and the Baha'i faith. And lastly, as a Christian, I was having a conversation about whether or not Jesus Christ was a black man or a white man. And I said, he's Asian. And I said, well, how does he get to be Asian? I says, well, politically, if you want to look at the Middle East, you tell me what continent it belongs to. It belongs to Asia. So again, you see the connection now between the religion. And furthermore, Joseph, when he went to Egypt, the Pharaoh who was ruling is also from the same area that Abraham was from, along the Tigris Euphrates. So when we start looking at connections between people and the original indigenous people, we can't kill them out without killing ourselves because they're a part of us. And when we acknowledge their contributions and the connections, the connection of religion, spirit, God within all of us, I mean, we really need to get back to looking at our indigenous people to really tell us what it's like to be respectful of each other and our connections.
Bertrand, it's always good to have you. Love you, man. Take care. Alex.
Thank you, Mr. Bathke.
You're welcome. Respect.
Uh,
I was
Dr.
just gonna.
Go ahead, please.
He made me think of another, well, not another issue, but like Navajo is a matrilineal culture where everything flows from the oldest daughter and mother on down, and that also, in term plays an important role in the spiritual identity of people. But my point being is that traditional Navajo belief really values, and in this case, really elevates the importance of the woman. Now, unfortunately, a lot of Western thoughts have affected how a lot of indigenous men act now. But traditional, like Navajo belief, and a lot of other kind of what, like Dr. Bathke was alluding to, really, had a important and a value placed on women. And as we know in the Baha'i faith, that that is we're here to exalt women and to support them so that we can become those two wings of one bird. So but that's another aspect where I think we can learn
In the future, definitely. Alex.
Thank you. We do have one more question and one more comment for this evening. And I know that we're running up to the top of the hour, so I'll try and be quick with both. For the question, you mentioned that one of the spiritual concepts related to the indigenous community is that there's a belief that everything and everyone comes from Mother Earth, and so that we are all part of one family. Do the Baha'is have similar teachings in the faith regarding how believers should approach and treat each other?
Well, in terms of the humans, as the Baha'i faith, one of the main principles, the Baha'is have is the oneness of mankind, and that basically we are one spiritual family, one human family. Of course, we have our own distinctions, our own qualities, and what have you. Those are actually to be celebrated and to be embraced. But essentially, that we are of one family, and that by better embracing that principle, we can then further in the notions of justice and how this world should be. And so those that principle is one of it is a principle of Baha'i faith. It's very central to our belief that there's no difference between any one of us, and that but by not acknowledging that, not embracing that, is really the cause of a lot of injustice in the world. And so I think by using that as a central guiding principle in our interactions and our beliefs, that we can further justice and peace and unity in our world. So
Thank you. And then for our last
I don't know
comment slash question there, we'll look to Daniel Kemp. If you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi there. I wish this was in person because it was so beautiful, but we wouldn't have had your parents in the room either. And what your father, mother said was beautiful. I did get to witness the unity that you described at the Standing Rock. I was there doing some acupuncture, and just so many different nations represented and languages, and just children from those nations. So proud to be there. Just what an honor, and one of the most memorable times for me as an acupuncturist, I think. Getting to treat these beautiful souls, it was such a pleasure. But I just wanted to say one thing. It reminded me of this quote. One of the reasons I love the Baha'i faith so much is because of what John is talking about. There's a quote by Edwin Markham. It says, "He drew a circle that shut me out. Heretic, rebel, a thing to flout. But love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle and took him in." I just think the Baha'i faith it just scoops up the Native Americans who've been so abused by the religion that I was brought up in, and that religion is very it was isolating for those in it because it is so exclusive. But so what the Baha'i faith does is opens us to all these beautiful spiritual traditions in the world that we can then partake of genuinely and authentically, because like you said, we have 5 fingers, so we're all in this together. And so I love the Baha'i faith because of its acknowledgement and deep bow to the indigenous spiritualities all around the world. And for me, that's one of the most beautiful gifts I think the Baha'i faith has given to revitalize that indigenous spirituality.
well, thank you. Sorry if my internet is choppy, but thank you for sharing, and thank you for being at Standing Rock. I appreciate you being there, and also you sharing your experience today. Thank you very much. Going back to the quote that was shared at the beginning, it talks about should these Indian nations, these indigenous be, it uses the term educated, and it's very broad. I've kind of meditated on, I'm still thinking about what that means. But one of the things that I think that how the Baha'is can help indigenous in this regard is that, the reality for a lot of indigenous people is that because of colonization and boarding school and what have you, they really have lost their purpose. They have lost their way. They've been forced away from their spirituality. Their spirituality has been destroyed. And for lack of a better term, they've forgotten how noble they are. They've forgotten their spiritual purpose. And that leads to a lot of other issues, such as, low education, high crime rate, high suicide rate, all these other things. And so I think one of the things that the Baha'is can help is to remind the indigenous how beautiful they are, how noble they are. Noble have I created thee. And I think that with that kind of help and encouraging them to re-embrace their culture and the spiritual values that the Creator gave them, I think then can really uplift and elevate them. And I think that is one way in which I think the Baha'is can help indigenous collectively on their spiritual journey. So that's one thing I think about on that regarding the quote that was shared at the beginning. So, but thank you for sharing your stories and your perspective. Thank you.